Hello, I'm Milan Shravinsky. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. On this episode, we dive into Tajikistan's parliamentary elections, a topic which, on the surface, may seem like a small story compared to what is happening in the news sphere. In the days ahead of the vote, regional journalists were not predicting any sort of nail-biter. But here we are, post-election, and the reality is stranger than any prediction. The Tajik authorities have announced their preliminary election results, with the president's party winning a majority. So, what's the catch then? The OSCE, the election watchdogs, were noticeably absent. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So, this time around, let's get straight into our opening monologue. So let's talk about the absence of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe for a moment. In democratic theory, international observers are like the honest friend who tells you when you have spinach in your teeth. The results have been declared, but with no independent verification, it's hard to know if these numbers mean something or if they are just another chapter in the endless story of how can we trust this election? The absence of independent observers raises eyebrows and questions, not just about this election, but about the integrity of the process itself. Now, while the political circus in Tajikistan is important, our attention must also turn to another headline from the region. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have very recently finalized a border agreement. After years of tense negotiations and territorial disputes, these two nations decided to shake hands, figuratively and literally, and agree on their borderlines. It is a rare moment of cooperation in a region where geopolitical friction was as common as horse meat on the plate. The border deal, while perhaps even less eye-catching than election debacles, is no less significant. On the one hand, you have a nation celebrating elections without independent oversight, leaving you pondering the legitimacy of the results. On the other hand, you have a monumental border agreement that, if anything, signals a future where cooperation might finally trump conflict. But before we get too carried away with optimism, let's acknowledge the inherent truth of it all. Political progress is rarely a straight line, and sometimes the only thing that connects these disparate events is the sheer unpredictability of the political landscape. The absence of international watchdogs and the silent, behind-the-scenes diplomacy over borders reminds us that the truth is often hidden beneath layers and layers of bureaucracy. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Bruce Pannier, board member at the Caspian Policy Center. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here as always.
So the elections in Tajikistan have got to be one of the most secretive elections in the world. There is hardly any footage of that available. Why is that so?
Well, they prohibited foreign media from reporting on election day. Not that there is much foreign media in Tajikistan at the moment anyway, but groups like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Tajik Service, there's another group called Asia Plus, a couple others, they were told ahead of time that they were not supposed to be reporting on election day.
So the leader of the country, Emomali Rahmon, he's been around for quite a while, and his official title just happens to be Founder of Peace and National Unity and Leader of the Nation. With a title like that, would anyone expect this to be an example of free and transparent elections?
No, certainly not. And of course, they've never had free and transparent elections, certainly for the last more than 20 years. Going into this election, all the parties that were participating in it were pro-government. So it's very hard to distinguish them one from the other. It was clear that the ruling party, the so-called People's Democratic Party of Tajikistan, was going to take the majority of the seats, which they did. The Agrarian Party managed to get a couple more seats than they had before. But this is just kind of a reshuffling. As long as the ruling party has the most seats and the majority in the House, the other pro-government parties, every election kind of move up a point or move down a point or something. There's really no mystery to this election. In the end, it really has no significance for policy making at all.
But historically, there used to be authentic opposition parties, including one which focused on Islam, and they were actually banned. Can you tell us more about how this system actually got to the place where it is now, where essentially you only have a rubber stamp parliament and political parties which will hardly disagree on anything significant? And that's why they are actually allowed to have seats in parliament, by the way.
Yes, this is a great question, and it goes back to your when you mentioned the title of Rahman. He's the founder of the peace. Tajikistan had a civil war from 1992 to 1997. The terms of the armistice, the truce that ended the civil war, was that the opposition would get 30% of the seats in government. Now, one of the parties that made up one of the groups that made up the opposition during the civil war was the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan. After that, according to the terms of the peace deal, they were legalized. It was not only the only legalized Islamic political party in Tajikistan, but in all of Central Asia. They did have seats in parliament for a while, a long time actually. They had places in the government. They had the former minister of emergency situations was from the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan. Until the 2015 election, they always had at least 2 seats in parliament, but they lost those 2 seats in the 2015 parliamentary elections. And shortly after that, they were declared. First, the Central Election Commission said that they weren't present in all parts of the country, so they annulled their registration. And then a couple months after that, there was an alleged coup attempt. It's still murky to this day exactly what happened. It did not seem to involve the IRPT at all, but the government took advantage of this coup attempt to say that the IRPT was behind it. They took them to court, banned them as an extremist group, arrested the leaders that were still in the country, and shut down the party entirely. It's too bad because that party really was, an opposition party, and they did put new ideas forward, which often prompted the government to counter with their own ideas, or at least imitate some of the reforms that were being mentioned by the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan. And I should also mention about the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, too, that they were extremely moderate. They condemned the Taliban. They condemned the Islamic State or ISIS, and later the Islamic State of Khorasan province. So they were actually, good allies of the government with a lot of authority to comment on Islamic matters. But the government decided that since they were a legitimate and genuine opposition party, they were unwanted in Tajikistan and went to these extreme measures to oust them, not only from the government, but entirely from the country.
So now we're back to a strongman leader style for Mr. Rahman, but also no OSCE being present in the course of these elections. Does it have any bearing on the perceived legitimacy, or is it just the case that if you're from the Western camp, you're going to say the elections were not free and fair? If you're not, for example, like the Shanghai cooperation organizations, you're going to say that it was fine and nothing really happened that would require any sort of intervention or criticism.
Yeah, the OSCE, of course, they have monitored previous elections, parliamentary and presidential in Tajikistan, and they've always said that they weren't free or fair. It wasn't conducted well. There wasn't really any opportunity for any opposition groups or independents to participate in the election. So we pretty much knew what the OSCE was going to say. The Tajik government has been ignoring to the greatest extent possible any criticism that comes from the West, but also from international communities. The UN Working Group for Arbitrary Detention has sent requests to Tajikistan several times, commenting on court cases that appeared, some involving the IRPT members, that appeared to be extremely biased, unfair, and unfounded. And the Tajik government simply didn't respond to those. Now, in the case of the OSCE, it's interesting that they had put in their request to have monitors and observers. Now, what they need is an official invitation, and there's a lot of paperwork that goes with this too. The Tajik government, when the OSCE finally announced in early February that they would not be able to monitor these elections because they had not received proper accreditation from the Tajik authorities responded that they were busy with their own election observers that they had to send to Belarus, and so they were out when the OSCE papers came in and invited the OSCE to resubmit their papers. But by then it was, less than a month before election. So it was disingenuous offer to let the OSCE in at that point. They waited until the deadline had passed. And then when the OSCE said they couldn't do it, then the Tajik government said, well, there's extenuating circumstances and we're ready to let you in, but it was far too close to the date to actually have OSCE observers on the ground. I think what it really says is, as you mentioned, that the Tajik government just doesn't care anymore about Western criticism. They don't want it. And the easiest way to avoid it was to just not let OSCE or ODIHR observers come and monitor the elections.
So we know fairly little about how these elections really went, apart from the official results. But what we do know is that Tajikistan is also involved quite heavily in the efforts to finally make peace with Kyrgyzstan, to end the long-standing border dispute about a border running across the Fergana Valley. So can you tell us more about these latest efforts? What does it change for the regional situation there at the present stage?
Well, this was of course a very positive event that they finally resolved the borders. I mean, let's face it; it's been more than 30 years since the Soviet Union fell apart and these countries became independent. And all this time, they've had this border conflict, which has only gotten worse in recent years. Remembering that in April 2021, there was battles along the border that ended up killing dozens of people, and then again in 2022. There was, pitched battles that involved armored vehicles, artillery, rockets, and actually the first use of drones, military drones. And more than 100 people were killed again, plus the widespread destruction in the area. So, this was really something that not just between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan it was a problem, but across Central Asia, the other governments were getting pretty worried that this seemed to be getting worse, and they wanted to see an end to it. So. They have signed a deal. They have agreed on where the border is between their two countries. The devil is going to be in the detail. I've been down there several times. It's a very difficult border to divide because there's no natural border there. It's not like there's a river or a mountain range or something. I mean, the border goes in and out, back and forth. There's a road, for instance, that I traveled on, and one side of the road is Tajikistan and the other side of the road is Kyrgyzstan. Now, who does the road belong to, or do you divide that in the middle? It's going to be a little bit difficult to convince the locals after all this fighting, that's really been building up for the last 15 years, that this border deal ends all that. But it is a positive event. It resolve some of the problems anyway. I would also mention that at the end of this month, the presidents of Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan, the three countries that share borders in the Fergana Valley, are all going to meet. So this might also push efforts at easing tensions along the border and promoting cooperation between these three countries forward a little bit. It's long overdue, but you can't underestimate you can't underestimate the importance of this border deal that Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan just signed, because it hopefully puts an end to destruction and death that's been there for, like I said, more than a decade now.
So a road being split into two pieces by a border, I bet that any sort of traffic accident litigation has to be a nightmare. But coming back to the question of resolving this issue. Now, we obviously have Russia's long shadow, which is still looming above the entire region. How does Russia look upon these latest developments? We know that it is still heavily involved, but is also trying to fend off the rising influence of China.
Well, again, this is a great question, because you would think that Russia would be the ideal mediator for this, since they drew the borders, right? And in fact, Putin gave over maps to both sides, of what the borders looked like in the 20s and what they looked like in the 30s and what they agreed on in the 1950s to try to help them to solve their border dispute. But Russia really didn't want to get very heavily involved in this, because in the end, it's tough for anyone to mediate this kind of deal. I mean, I've seen when they've tried to resolve border issues before or other internal problems with outside help. And usually what ends up happening is that one side feels that this mediator is biased and favors the other side. And that's certainly been the case with Russia. It's important to note that Russia has military bases in both Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Both Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization also. So you would think that Russia would be able to help with the mediation, but when it came down to trying to find someone who could come in and help push the Tajiks and Kyrgyz to the negotiation table, it was very, very difficult to find anyone who was willing to step forward and actually do that, probably because they were worried that if one side would think they were getting the short end of the stick, so to speak, and they would blame Russia for siding with the other side.
So Russia not willing to get involved in moving borders around, well, that's new, if you excuse the sarcasm. Anyway, this is our wrap-up of the situation in Tajikistan and the border between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Bruce Pannier was our guest today here on Eastern Express. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Ukraine's sovereign bonds have faced sharp fluctuations in recent weeks as geopolitical tensions and uncertainty over US support shake investor confidence. Hopes for a financial boost were dashed after a tense Oval Office meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and US President Donald Trump ended in a shouting match, leading to a significant drop in bond prices.
Following Donald Trump's election in November last year, Ukraine's sovereign bonds rose in price as investors expected a quicker end to the war. However, Ukraine's debt has fluctuated dramatically in recent weeks due to geopolitical tensions and uncertainty about Trump's willingness to support the war-torn country. Most bonds had recovered many losses last week as investors anticipated a minerals agreement during Zelensky's Washington visit, potentially securing Trump's backing for Ukraine's war effort. These hopes, however, were dashed after the Oval Office meeting ended in a shouting match. According to TradeWeb data, Ukraine's 2036 maturity bonds saw the steepest decline, dropping 4.5 cents to 60.75 cents on the dollar. Bonds tied to economic performance also took a hit, with trading activity remaining high. Ukraine restructured its debt with bondholders in September, leaving it with approximately $15.2 billion in obligations across 8 new bond series, along with $2.6 billion tied to a GDP warrant. This restructuring reduced the country's external debt by roughly $9 billion, with the earliest bond maturing in 2029.
The European Commission is exploring ways to ensure Ukraine maintains satellite communications in case access to SpaceX's Starlink network is restricted. With Starlink playing a crucial role in Ukraine's military and civilian operations, officials are assessing potential replacements, including EU-backed satellite networks, to ensure continued connectivity in the event of disruptions.
Starlink has been crucial for Ukraine's military and civilian infrastructure, with around 42,000 terminals supporting battlefield communications, medical facilities, businesses, and aid organizations. However, concerns have grown following reports that the US allegedly threatened to cut Ukraine's access unless Kyiv reached a deal with Washington over critical mineral resources, a claim SpaceX CEO Elon Musk denied. Ukraine has expressed interest in alternative satellite options, including GovSatcom, a shared network of EU government satellites, and IRIS, a future EU constellation expected to be operational in the 2030s. European Parliament member Christopher Grudler has urged the EU to fast-track GovSatcom's deployment, suggesting that bypassing the certification process could allow it to serve as a temporary replacement for Starlink, while IRIS is still under development.
Traffic-related fatalities in Central Asia and the Caucasus have reached alarming levels, with Kazakhstan and Tajikistan experiencing significant spikes in deaths in 2024. Experts attribute the high death rates to factors such as poor vehicle maintenance, reckless driving, and inadequate road infrastructure.
Traffic-related deaths remain a major issue in the Caucasus and Central Asia, with both regions consistently recording some of the highest auto fatality rates in the world. In 2024, Kazakhstan saw its highest number of traffic deaths in a decade, with 2,579 fatalities, while Tajikistan recorded 552 deaths. Kyrgyzstan's rate of traffic accidents remained alarmingly high, with about 1,000 accidents per million people. The situation is no better in the Caucasus. Georgia saw a slight increase in fatalities in 2024, and according to the World Population Review, Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan ranked among the highest globally for traffic-related fatalities per million people. Kazakhstan led the region with the highest fatality rate at 129 deaths per million in 2024. Experts point to a combination of factors contributing to the high death rates, including poorly maintained vehicles, aggressive driving, alcohol consumption, and inadequate road infrastructure.
Transnistria, a breakaway region of Moldova, remains a Soviet-era time capsule clinging to its unrecognized independence for more than 30 years. While its residents struggle with poor economy, many nostalgically yearn for stability and security of the region's Soviet past.
Transnistria, a narrow strip of land along the Dniester River, has long been a flashpoint of political tension. Officially part of Moldova, it declared independence in 1990 following the collapse of the Soviet Union, but has never been recognized by any country, including Russia, despite its strong ties to Moscow. The region is home to around 500,000 people, many of whom are ethnic Russians and Ukrainians, with a history deeply intertwined with Soviet influence. In the early 1990s, Transnistria fought a brief but intense war against Moldova after tensions escalated following Moldova's declaration of independence. A ceasefire was reached in 1992, but the region remained in a state of de facto independence with its own government, military and currency. Over the years, Transnistria has become heavily dependent on Russian support, both politically and economically. Russian troops remain stationed there as peacekeepers, a lingering reminder of the Soviet era. Today, life in Transnistria is marked by a desire to return to the good old days of Soviet stability. Many locals yearn for the economic and social security of the Soviet period, recalling it as a time of relative prosperity and unity. The region remains economically isolated and its infrastructure is in poor condition. However, the people of Transnistria continue to hold on to their Soviet identity, with the hammer and sickle still prominently displayed in public spaces and the region's flag resembling the old Soviet banner.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and features. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.